Welcome! Today we will examine the Sabbat World's Crusade and its impact on the Imperium's struggle for control over lost territories. Sabbat World's Crusade. It seems the High Lords of Terror approve of the work we've done together. We've been given our crusade, the Sabbat Worlds. Warmaster Slado after the Kulan campaign. The Sabbat World's Crusade was an imperial crusade that spanned over 45 standard years, starting in the year 755 of the 41st millennium and continuing until at least 791 of the 41st millennium. The purpose of this crusade was to retake the Sabbat World sector situated at the rimward edge of the Segmentum Pacificus from the heretical forces of chaos. This crusade was one of the largest and most significant imperial military operations undertaken in the 41st millennium, and ultimately ended solar decades later in the reconquest of the sector by the armed forces of the Imperium of Man. Origins: Sabbat Worlds. Situated along a rimward portion of the Segmentum Pacificus, the region now known as the Sabbat World sector was first annexed for imperial colonization in the 35th millennium. This often volatile region of space is composed of over 100 human-inhabited star systems, subdivided into a number of discrete territories or subsectors, most notably the Newfound Trailing, the Khan Group, the Cabal Systems, the Carcharodon Cluster, and the Erinyes Group. It is rumored that the Blood Pact, a highly organized chaos warrior cult devoted to the blood god Khorne, originally came from a star system in this sector. First annexed for imperial colonization in the 35th millennium, the name Sabbat honors the region's original redeemer, Saint Sabbat. This young girl received a vision from the Emperor of Mankind, urging her to bring the region into the Imperium during an imperial crusade that lasted for 105 standard years, beginning in the year 500 of the 35th millennium. By the 37th millennium, mankind was well established throughout the region, with an estimated population of roughly 5 trillion and a thriving local interstellar economic infrastructure. However, due to its exposure to the eternal threats of the Outer Dark along the galactic rim, control of the Sabbat worlds was ever disputed with the forces of chaos and various Xenos species. Throughout the 38th millennium, the region suffered a series of brutal wars and conflicts with the barbaric, chaos-worshipping human tribes of the so-called sanguinary worlds, located further rimwards of the spinward extent of the Sabbat worlds, and the area soon became known as a troublesome province to the administratum. However, during the first centuries of the 41st millennium, the situation altered drastically. A charismatic, brutal chaos warlord, known as an Archon, rallied the tribes of the sanguinary worlds to war, and a series of assaults began from galactic trailward into the region. The assault was thought at first to be a return to the minor chaos conflicts of the 38th millennium in the region, but in the standard years following 600 of the 41st millennium, it became impossible to ignore the true threat presented by Chaos Undivided. The ruinous powers had decided to take the whole region away from the Imperium, and their chosen forces launched a series of devastating attacks into the sector, conquering and destroying everything in their path. The ultimate goal of the forces of chaos in the sector was to drive out the Imperium and re-establish their mastery over the worlds they had been driven from by Saint Sabbat and her original imperial crusade in the 35th millennium. These Sabbat incursions were just one of a half-dozen major chaos invasions suffered by the imperial star systems of the Segmentum Pacificus during this period. The imperial defense of the Sabbat worlds proved valiant but ultimately unequal to the task. Though it should be noted that the Imperium was simultaneously fighting 8 other significant campaigns throughout imperial-controlled space during this period. To consolidate their lines of defense, the Segmentum Pacificus High Command had to make bitter decisions, sacrificing certain portions of imperial space in order to enhance the Imperium's best chance to resist the chaos onslaught. Severely underestimating the Archon's forces, the Segmentum High Command tried to do what they thought best for the Sabbat worlds. But ultimately, The meagre imperial defence was not enough, and the sector was conquered wholesale by the servants of the ruinous powers, returning the Sabbat worlds to their heretical roots. The Sabbat worlds were swiftly reconquered and occupied by the Archon's forces, although many imperial worlds in the region continued to resist as isolated outposts of the Emperor's Light in a vast sea of apostasy and heresy. Some managed to hold out for solar decades, whilst others managed to do so for more than a Terran century. Unfortunately, by the year 740 of the 41st millennium, the Sabbat worlds could no longer be considered to be under imperial governance, as this troublesome province was reclassified by the Administratum as an unstable, hazardous region of space. In 741 of the 41st millennium, the Civitas Imperialis was officially suspended in the region by the Administratum, and the sector's Lord Governor was moved to a neighbouring sector for his own safety. The Sabbat worlds were from this point forward regarded as entirely lost to the Imperium, having become dominions of chaos. Impending war. Following the disastrous loss of the Sabbat worlds in the year 741 of the 41st millennium, there were many suggestions to send a military expedition to liberate the besieged sector. This idea was especially championed by the exiled sector governor, but those within the high echelon of the imperial military had little or no enthusiasm for such an investiture of time, expense and materials, all except for Lord Militant Slado. This very capable imperial commander was already noted and experienced, owing his fame to the string of several stunning victories he had won during the successful Kulan Wars, which took place from 752 to 754 of the 41st millennium. A tactical genius, Slado capitalized on his popularity within the rank and file of the Astra Militarum and petitioned the High Lords of Terror for the honor of leading the Imperial Crusade to liberate the Sabbat worlds. As a Lord Militant, Slado actively sought to lead the Crusade, petitioning the High Lords directly during the Kulan campaign. He had supported the action as early as the year 732 of the 41st millennium, as he felt a strong passion for the liberation of the hard-won territories that had been so poorly discarded. Many of his senior commanders and aides related that Slado believed this to be an imperial crime. In the year 755 of the 41st millennium, the High Lords finally declared him War Master and charged him with the sacred duty of carrying out this monumental undertaking. Slado's subsequent elevation to this esteemed position was the envy of his fellow Lords Militant, which were quickly tempered by the realization of the task that had been set before Slado. The War Master's only overriding fear was that at his advanced age, 150 standard years, he would not live to see the eventual victorious completion of such a massive campaign. Consolidation of imperial forces in the year 755 of the 41st millennium. War Master Slado and his senior staff commanders spent nearly the entire standard year planning at Kulan for the opening phase of advance into the Sabbat worlds. The vast imperial armada began to assemble and stage at Kulan, Kulan Outreach, San Sargo, Kazin II, Arvinx Cardinal and the Bethan Halo. The War Master compiled an impressive imperial force comprised of almost 1 billion imperial guardsmen of the Astra Militarum, along with massive retinues of armour and artillery, 6 chapters of Adeptus Astartes, and Titan legions from the Collegia Titanica, provided by the Adeptus Mechanicus. The War Master studied and rejected over 30 attack plans until he found a scheme that would favour the imperial military strength the most. All options were weighed and considered until this final scheme was decided upon. Codenamed Redrake, War Master Slado sent the signal to advance on the 266th day of the year 755 of the 41st millennium. Operation Redrake, the years 755 to 756 of the 41st millennium. Slado believed that in order to launch a successful imperial crusade into the Sabbat worlds, his massive mobilization of imperial forces would have to take the fight to several fronts from the outset of hostilities in order for the crusade to prosper. The best solution for initial advancement required a mobile fleet to accomplish fourfold objectives. First, to secure a foothold in the Sabbat worlds that could be developed. Second, to catch the archenemy unaware. Thirdly, to defuse any enemy response away from a concentrated counterattack on his fleet. Fourthly, to provide a quick and, in his words, showy victory to maintain Allied morale. Already his enemies had shown signs of preparation on their part. Operation Redrake, named for the Redrake snake, a multi-headed predator that could attack several targets at once with deadly effect, would involve simultaneous invasions of the newfound trailing group, Onscard and Long Hallant, and a 4th Imperial Fleet Division striking all the way to the core of the system at Indrid. These multiple assaults, the War Master hoped, would partition the Chaos forces and confuse their response and any immediate attempt on their part to develop and implement a counter-strategy. Slado selected the Lords Militant Hummel and Delaney to lead the attack on Onscard, Generals Dravere and Akensor for Long Hallant. Lord Militant Cybon for Indrid, and Slado himself would lead the assault on Formal Prime. Despite the massive size of his Imperial Expeditionary Fleet, the attacks were conducted as lightning strikes as they engaged directly from retranslation from warp space. Long Hallant fell immediately due to the modest numbers of hostile force which the Imperials easily overwhelmed. Less than 3 solar weeks later, Onscar was also taken. There were some bitter pockets of resistance in the outlying cities, but these were extinguished by the start of the year 756 of the 41st millennium. The assault on Formal Prime, however, proved to be the first substantive opposition for the new War Master and provided the Imperial forces their first taste of how bloody the Crusade would become. The complexity of the terrain and the fanaticism of the opposition would prove to be a hindrance in the War Master's stated objective of securing the planet within 6 solar weeks. The initial assault went well, but then progress began to founder, as the zealous followers of Chaos made the Imperials pay dearly for their overconfidence, as the attrition rate for the Imperial Guardsmen climbed to untenable levels. Nearly 200 soldiers died for every metre of ground taken. With casualties mounting and the assault grinding down into its 11th week, Slado knew his reputation was at stake, as was the overall morale of the Crusade. The impasse was finally broken by the deployment of a force of White Scars Space Marines whose highly mobile assault tactics purged the hive world of the remaining heretics. Lord Militant Cybon also faced staunch opposition as rapid reinforcements were brought in from Melsar and Taliskant. Fighting a war on 2 fronts, Cybon executed a brilliant feint withdrawal that drew in the forces of the arch-enemy onto his ranged batteries at Colquis, utilizing orbital bombardment at the expense of ground troops. But despite these setbacks, Operation Redrake had succeeded in achieving its goals. Now the way was open for the next phase of the Crusade. Slado dubbed these follow-up assaults as Operation Newfound. Bloody path to Balhaut, the years 756 to 764 of the 41st millennium. The opposition of the forces of Chaos within the Sabbat worlds had, so far, proven to be more difficult and intense than the high echelon of commanders of the Crusade had originally envisioned. Tactical records showed that the War Master revised his estimated liberation date for Balhaut at least 37 times as the Crusade bogged down due to fierce organized resistance, throwing off the War Master's calculated schedule time and again. These difficulties were compounded by 3 factors. Firstly, the bodies of enemy population dug into various world sites, armored against attack and prepared for resistance. These populations sometimes numbered in the millions and were often under the leadership of a sacred and charismatic leader, sometimes with the rank of Magister, Lieutenant. Secondly, there were the counter-assault forces sent by the Archon to meet the Imperial push in the form of raider fleets and military convoys. These raider fleets were highly mobile and able to concentrate their attacks on the Imperial forward echelon. Within the last 2 solar months of the year 756 of the 41st millennium alone, 8 significant fleet engagements occurred. Thirdly, there were smaller Chaos raiding forces, referred to as mobile opportunists, that plagued Crusade deployments by running raids and guerrilla assaults on supply lines and relay depots. Operation Newfound, the years 756 to 764 of the 41st millennium. Ashek II, the years 756 to 757 of the 41st millennium. The second phase of the Crusade, known as Operation Newfound, focused its priorities on the liberation of the Newfound Trailing Group. Just before the initial phase of Newfound took place, the Crusade focused on liberating the towering hive cities of Ashek II. The prosecution of Ashek II began early in the year 756 of the 41st millennium, but the scale of the fighting increased in the year 757 of the 41st millennium. Their task of liberating the planet was made extremely difficult by the fact that they faced the notorious and brilliant Heritor Asphodel, one of the most tactically gifted magisters serving the Archon. Asphodel showed a predilection for deploying grotesque demonic war engines that were dubbed woe machines. Some speculate that somewhere in the Magister's past, he may have had some connection to a Forge world or even to the cult Mechanicus itself. The Imperial commanders soon became painfully aware of the futility of sending Imperial waves of infantry troops against Asphodel's woe machines. Petitioned for heavier support, Slado responded by providing 3 brigades of armour from the Mershan 45th and 2nd Narmenian heavy regiments. Significant gains were only made later when nearly a full-strength squadron of battle titans of the Collegia Titanica arrived to support the Imperial assault. This was the first significant deployment of Adeptus Mechanicus war engines in the Crusade. Led by the ancient Imperator-class Titan Imperius Corporalis, the mighty war machine's subsequent engagements lasted for 3 solar months. In the end, Asphodel's woe machines were destroyed, and the defeated Magister fled Ashek II. Ambold XI, the year 756 of the 41st millennium. Initially, Ambold XI had been an opening phase target of the Crusade, but at the final hour had been rejected by War Master Slado. Ambold XI became instead a target for the second phase, Operation Newfound, and the assault began in the middle of the year 756 of the 41st millennium. A swift and brutal fleet action commanded by Admiral Carsleye commenced, and the Imperial forces successfully decimated the orbital forts above the planet and destroyed enemy shipping at both high and low anchor. This allowed for Imperial troop forces under the command of General Dylan Belfry to execute an overnight drop into strategic enemy strongholds. The forces of the archenemy were well entrenched, driving back the Imperial Guardsmen during successive actions. Approximately 9,500 Guardsmen were killed trying to breach the sturdy concentric walls defending these citadels. General Belfry himself was killed in a mortar attack. His subordinate, Colonel Begolin of the Sarpoi regiments, attempted to consolidate the losses, but foolishly managed to trap the main portion of the Imperial ground forces between a deadly crossfire. Space Marines of the Iron Snakes, en route to Sverren, answered the frantic signals, voluntarily diverted and made a drop-pod assault on the targeted cities to relieve the desperate and beleaguered Imperial Guard forces. The proud warriors of Ithaca put 2 hives to the sword as 29,000 of the arch-enemy troopers were slaughtered, with only the loss of 81 Iron Snakes. A solar week later, the last targeted hive fell as the Iron Snakes stormed the walls and executed the arch-enemy leaders by crucifixion. Colonel Begolin was subsequently executed by the Commissariat for gross leadership errors. Sverren, the years 757 to 758 of the 41st millennium. Sverren was a key world strategically central to the region known as the Holy Visage, and was in the remit of Operation Newfound. Once again, the brutal campaign to liberate this world was mired by circumstance and the tenacity of the arch-enemy's forces. Commanded by Lord Militant Humel and General Bulledin, an Astra Militarum army invaded in the year 757 of the 41st millennium, routing the gathering of Chaos troops and killing Magister Cuvelo in the initial assault. But circumstances quickly changed when the weather turned bad and Imperial ground forces were forced to dig in, bogging down the assault. The forces of the archenemy were able to regroup and attempted to repulse the Imperial forces. General Buladin braved the inclement weather, pushing his battalions towards the city of Ramari. Encircling the city, it soon fell after a short siege. Lord Militant Humel focused his efforts on the city of Kolkis, and after a 6-week aerial campaign, eventually won air superiority on Sverren. Nefer City proved to be much more difficult to subdue, as Buladin lost 3,000 soldiers for the gain of only 2 kilometers of land. Offering his resignation to War Master Slado for his failure, it was refused. Slado sent back a dispatch which read, "Do it again." Buladin took his orders from the War Master to heart, and finally, on the 241st day of the year, 758 of the 41st millennium, Buladin's forces and a single warlord-class Titan, the Victrix Impassionata, overran the walls of Nefer City. Storming the upper palace, the Magister's second-in-command, Patabuka, was killed while resisting capture. Fornax Aleph, the years 757 to 759 of the 41st millennium. The campaign on the hive world of Fornax Aleph proved to be troublesome from the very beginning, highlighting the difficulties faced by the Imperial forces when encountering a world that had been affected by chaos in the most unnerving and inexplicable ways. Fornax Aleph had been established by long-range fleet reconnaissance to be a powerful bastion of the forces of chaos in the year 757 of the 41st millennium. Heavy fighting was expected, as Fornax Aleph appeared to contain formidable hive cities and a possible fleet reserve. Under the command of General Jeta Elbeth, a large ground force composed of 7 Astra Militarum regiments of infantry troops and 2 armoured brigades prepared for the assault on the enemy's stronghold. Their forces would be further reinforced by elements of the Iron Snake's chapter. The initial assault was delayed twice due to unusually potent warp storms, the second of which forced the Iron Snakes into a 4-solar-month holding pattern. General Elbeth's invasion fleet also suffered from the warp storms, which scattered his invasion fleet as they arrived at Fornax Aleph. Unfortunately for Elbeth, only 1/3 of his fleet arrived unmolested, and of the promised Astartes support, there was no sign. The general cautiously moved his fleet to an out-system translation point to hold until their reinforcements arrived, or, in the event of an attack, translate into warp space at the first sign of trouble. Not wanting to waste the opportunity, on the 303rd day of the year, 757 of the 41st millennium, Elbeth ordered one of his frigates to pass by the planet and assess the strength and disposition of the enemy forces. The frigate reported, to the astonishment of the Elbeth's tactical staff, that they had encountered no resistance because the world's orbital fleet yards were entirely empty of activity. Furthermore, they detected no activity on the planet's surface, no electromagnetic activity, no power or industry, no motion whatsoever. According to orbital Auspex scans, the great hive cities of Fornax Aleph were totally empty and dead. The following day, the general took advantage of the situation and landed a spearhead force in advance of the reinforcements. There was no resistance, as Elbeth's forces soon discovered that the world was entirely bereft of life. Plague was initially suspected, or some other unknown mortality, but there were no signs of either bodies or burial pits. Destructive temple columbusage, General Elbeth's Imperial Guard troopers, exploring another abandoned hive city on Fornax Aleph. Appraising War Master Slado of the situation, Elbeth sent extensive reports on the strange occurrence. Fornax Aleph was, for all intents and purposes, a vacant world. Its population had simply disappeared without a trace and without explanation. The reports continued back and forth between the General and the War Master until, on the first day of the year 758 of the 41st millennium, when transmissions from Elbeth's Liberation Force ceased. Arriving 80 solar days later, due to severe warp storm delays, the Iron Snakes reported to the War Master that there were no Imperial forces on Fornax Aleph at all. The Iron Snakes scoured the planet for any signs of the General and his troops, and their battle barges searched the nearby in-system. Whatever inexplicable fate had befallen the people of Fornax Aleph had now overtaken Elbeth and his liberation force as well. The War Master signalled to the Astartes to withdraw their forces before a similar fate befell them too, but on the 130th day of the year 757 of the 41st millennium, circumstances changed dramatically. A previously undetected comet or meteor struck the planet in the polar regions, causing great natural disasters. The Iron Snakes hunkered down and rode out the devastation, but the impact brought with it dire portents. Hordes of demons came forth, pouring out of the devastated northern ice shelf and congregating around the hive cities. The world of Fornax Aleph was infested by these creatures of chaos. Led by Brother Captain Kules, the Iron Snakes' assault force, 300 battle brothers strong, were besieged by the uncounted multitude of infernal creatures. In the first month of the year 759 of the 41st millennium, delayed portions of General Elbeth's assault force finally arrived in system and immediately deployed in support of the Astartes on the planet's surface. But the valiant Iron Snakes had already destroyed the demonic army, emerging victorious. A viable explanation for the disappearance of Fornax Aleph's population has never been made, though some suggest that there may have been a connection with the warp storm activity in system at the time. The Imperium eventually recolonized the vacant planet, repopulating its massive empty hives. There have been no further reports of strange disappearances or other significant activity, though there are still reports of unexplained screams of anguish in the dead of night. Kokia Minus, the years 760 to 773 of the 41st millennium. Kokia Minus was one of the more problematic worlds encountered during the newfound trailing. Dubbed as the world that refused to die, Kokia Minus collectively cost more Imperial lives than the fighting on the notorious fortress world of Moorland. It has been estimated that over 8 million Imperial Guardsmen perished, fighting for the liberation of the planet. At the beginning of the campaign, the Imperial forces made an auspicious start. A series of assaults were made under the command of General Kelso and General Thorgs. Also, at the beginning of the campaign, Lord Militant Vicris was sent to depose General Thorgs, whose behaviour had become increasingly erratic. It was later rumoured that he was actually replaced following a heated argument with the War Master. Later that year, Vicris and 47 men in his retinue were killed in an enemy armour ambush due to faulty intelligence, in what came to be referred to as the Sabre Bridge incident. Famous for his trust in armour, Kelso directed the main thrust of the assault, winning 3 hive cities, Harshan, Boliquin and Nazeth, in a 6-month period. Employing armoured forces against the arch-enemy, 2 significant tank battles took place, eventually winning the outer hab of Harshan. Despite these Imperial triumphs, the war on Kokia Minus ground down to a tediously slow pace. The world was finally taken in 762 of the 41st millennium after an extensive and punishing ground war. But the world's future was a troubled one as fleeing forces of the arch-enemy retook the planet twice. After 3 more long and bitterly contested campaigns were fought there, Imperial domination finally occurred in the year 773 of the 41st millennium. Second Battle of Sverren, the years 760 to 761 of the 41st millennium. Operation Newfound continued to experience significant impediments. Pockmarks of resistance continued to hamper the Crusade's efforts. To compound matters further, in the year 760 of the 41st millennium, a fierce and bloody counterstrike ripped into the Imperial's midline. Led by Archon Nadzibar himself, the world of Sverren fell to the forces of the archenemy. For only the second time in 5 standard years, the world found itself the site of major warfare. General Buladin soon found himself in command of the Imperial forces on Sverren, as he had experienced fighting in the land war on the contested planet 2 standard years earlier. His fierce determination was instrumental in preserving the declining morale of Imperial forces, as he refused to let the cursed world bedevil him twice. When relief convoys arrived in the year 761 of the 41st millennium, they soon determined that the beleaguered general had been fighting a war on 2 fronts, resisting both Magister Sholan Skara and the hosts of Archon Nadzibar himself. The arch-enemy forces were eventually driven to the tropical jungles of the southern continent. The forces of the archenemy were finally broken after 16 intense months of fighting. They soon fell into disarray as the momentum of their counterstrike was spent. The Archon and Magister Skara began a lengthy retreat to their final destiny on Balhaut. Final advance. Balhaut, the years 763 to 765 of the 41st millennium. The War Master grew impatient as the second phase of the Crusade took longer to accomplish than he had foreseen. Balhaut had been Slado's prized objective since the Crusade's inception. He knew the liberation of this world would prove to be both tactically and psychologically important. Despite the constant persuasion of Lords Militant Cybon and Dravera to alter their plans in regards to Balhaut, Slado refused to consider any alternative plans proposed by them. He would not compromise his original tactical plans to take Balhaut, as he knew it to be a key world, and to oust the Archon and his forces from the planet would deliver a serious blow to the arch-enemy forces. By ignoring Balhaut and turning rimward to annex the sparsely defended Nubila Reach and the belt of Eurystes, Slado believed their Crusade force would be left dangerously exposed along their coreward flank. In many regards, Slado's conduct in the Sabbat World's Crusade emulated the figure of Saint Sabbat Beati's original campaign in the sector. Fabian Ruse, the years 764 to 765 of the 41st millennium. Still in retreat from Sverren, Archon Nadzibar began to call upon his magisters and warlords to help formulate a large unified host against the Imperial Crusade. The Archon intended to draw the Imperial forces towards the world of Fabia, where he hoped to annihilate the Crusade in one fell swoop. Being a master of subterfuge, Slado recognized the Archon's attempts to draw his forces to Fabia, and ordered a series of false fleet dispositions and troop movements along various trade routes in order to suggest that he had fallen for the Archon's ruse and taken the bait. Suspecting that arch-enemy spies existed within the ranks of the Crusade, he also began to disseminate disinformation into intelligence traffic and munitorum orders, adding credibility to his deception. Gathering his forces for an assault on Fabia, the Archon maneuvered his forces into a gross mistake. In the year 765 of the 41st millennium, the arch-enemy forces were brought to Balhaut to be rearmed and resupplied. They were caught totally by surprise as the Imperial Crusade assaulted the planet. Operation Hellstorm, Balhaut, the year 765 of the 41st millennium. The assault on Balhaut would, in the future, remain a shining example of a planned military action that went according to plan and brought about the desired victory. Slado constructed his assault plan, codenamed Hellstorm, around the following key principles. Firstly, to achieve orbital superiority by fleet assault and to cause as much gross damage to enemy shipping as possible. Secondly, use sustained orbital bombardment of key surface regions. Thirdly, use a rapid and covered landing of primary planetary assault forces. Fourthly, use a rapid and covered landing of secondary planetary assault phases in reinforcement contingent on the outcome of earlier phases. Slado organized the fleet assault into 4 waves. The first spearhead wave was comprised of rapid attack warships under Admiral Christor. They arrived in System 16 solar hours before the initial start of hostilities, translating into real space on the far side of the local star. His warships then utilized the radiating mass of the star to conceal his fleet formations from the arch-enemy's planetary detector grids. The second wave was composed of troop ships, mass conveyance vessels, and heavy orbital assaulters under the command of Vice Admiral Garnhorst. They arrived in System 5 solar hours later, holding position within the sugar and hydrocarbon clouds beyond the system edge. These 2 waves endeavored to get on station in readiness without detection. The warp ripples caused by the gathering arch-enemy fleet in system also served to make their own translation and mass displacement patterns. The third wave was the primary assault warships under the command of Admiral Shaver. They translated directly into the inner system zone at the beginning of the attack, leading the assault on the high and low anchor stations and orbital batteries. After Shaver's signal of engagement, Admiral Krista's forces struck hard and fast against the great orbital dock facilities of Balhaut High Station and Haladan Threshold. Garnhorst's third wave then began its move in-system, coming in from behind the massing warships, preparing for the surface assault. Commanded by Vice Admiral Sunlock, the fourth wave then arrived out-system, carrying the mass reinforcement divisions. By the end of Hour 21, after the initiation of hostilities, orbital superiority had been achieved. Planetary bombardment then commenced against the key surface targets. By Hour 33, the planetary drop began in earnest, with Astra Militarum forces delivered to the surface, with an attrition rate of only 32% lost during the landings. North of the oligarchy, the percentage ran as high as 58%. By Hour 44, intense ground fighting ignited in the vast hive cities of Balhaut. Balopolis was one such city that saw extraordinary levels of fighting, which resulted in numerous casualties amongst the senior ranks of guard officers. General Kurrell initially commanded the forces at Balopolis, finding himself in a brutal confrontation with the Kith, commanded by Magister Sholan Skara. Kurrell was severely injured soon after Hour 48, forcing him to withdraw, and his replacement General Corson was killed around Hour 53 of the assault, and his replacement Marshal Burns was killed around Hour 58. With General Delany unable to get through to take command, Kurrell's command fell by default to the senior surviving officer amongst his staff, Commander Makaroth. When word reached War Master Slado of the dire circumstances that had befallen Kurrell's forces at Balopolis, he sent an immediate dispatch promoting Makaroth to the brevet rank of Marshal. The War Master elected to command the assault on the oligarchy himself. His landing force, the second largest single Imperial army fielded after Lord Militant Sybans, was cutting a bloody path into the heart of the enemy. Slado faced intense opposition from the hosts of 4 Magisters, including the infamous Heritor Asphodel and the murderous Chaos cult army of the Archon himself. The War Master's final assault on the oligarchy raged for 10 consecutive solar days. The sustained orbital bombardment had reduced the terrain into so much rubble, and a series of severe storms turned the entire area into an expanse of mudlakes. Several thousand Imperial Guardsmen perished in these deplorable conditions, sucked down into the slurry of mud or slaughtered by the Archon's forces when they became mired. On Day 5, the first breakthrough for the Imperial forces came in the form of Astartes from the White Scars chapter. They broke through the defence line at the Hallow Wall and routed the forces of Magister Kul Kolesh. The Magister was slain during a subsequent gun battle. On Day 7, squads of Astartes from the Silver Guard under Chapter Master Vigum broke through the outer line of the Emancipatory, where they faced stiff opposition from Chaos Dreadnoughts and Magister Asphodel's Woe Machines. This deadlock was eventually broken by a massed Imperial armour support involving multiple armoured brigades. Chapter Master Vigum then led the Silver Guard through, taking the Emancipatory in 2 solar hours, and stormed the monastery of St. Chiodrus with the aid of 3 Astra Militarum regiments. The Jantine patricians and elements of the Mordian Iron Guard 11th Regiment took the precinct of the oligarchy. On Day 9, Slado drove his left flank into the resolute oligarchy gate, which was commanded by Captain Alentis of the Silver Guard, but was devastated by the murderous Woe engines. The Hyrcan 8th Regiment was the first to reach the oligarchy gate and breach the enemy buttress fields and blow the gateway wide open. This breakthrough was swiftly supported by the Astartes of the Silver Guard, another Astra Militarum regiment, and 4 armoured divisions. Following an intense assault by the Hyrcan forces, the Tower of the Plutarch fell later that day. Slado himself finally entered the inner precincts, at the head of 8 regiments, and his personal bodyguard force prepared to face Archon Nadzibar. Death of Slado, Balhaut, the year 765 of the 41st millennium. I am done, and yet I am undone. Attributed to War Master Slado upon his deathbed. As War Master Slado pressed his final advance on the palace of the oligarchy, he received word of Marshal Makaroth's success at Balopolis. The young officer had turned Bellopolis from rout to unexpected imperial victory. The War Master was reported as being struck mute with great admiration. The price for taking the cursed planet had become all too evident to the embittered War Master. The weight of the crusade weighed heavily upon Sladeau. Some officers reported later that he seemed to be weary and fatalistic. Taking up his power sword, the War Master personally led the first attack wave against the palace of the oligarchy. The firefights that took place within the confines of the palace were brutal to the extreme. It was at this point that the War Master may have been seriously wounded, either by a blade or projectile puncture to the stomach, but it was not evident until the Medicae discovered the mortal wound when the War Master was on his deathbed. At hour 18 of the 10th solar day, Sladeau's command force encountered the Archon Nadzibar and his elite bodyguard on the western palisade. The War Master and the vile Archon soon joined in furiously intense single combat. Depending on sources, the fight lasted between 6 and 11 solar minutes, where Sladeau took 2 mortal wounds that he somehow managed to push past, maintaining the initiative, before delivering a lethal blow to the Archon. The Archon fell back, dying, and his cult followers stormed the palisade to retrieve their fallen leader and carry him away to safety. Astra Militarum units valiantly defended their fallen War Master, putting many cultists to their deaths. Sladeau was found, close to death, lying on the marble floor of the west atrium. He was far beyond any medical help, as his grievous wounds appeared to be fatal. The War Master's own bodyguard stormed the palisade and slaughtered any archenemy forces they came across. Archon Nadzibar's corpse was later discovered amongst a heap of massacred bodies near a fallen palanquin. Sladeau's men had indiscriminately cut down the fleeing cultists and only afterwards established the identity of their burden. What price? Victory, aftermath of Balhaut campaign. The year 765 of the 41st millennium. War Master Sladeau managed to live long enough to see the victory at Balhaut completed, although the pacification efforts would continue for a considerable amount of time. His premonition about himself not living to see the successful completion of the crusade had proved accurate, though many witnesses report that he died contently, resigned to his inevitable fate to die on Balhaut as if fully expecting it. It was noted that Sladeau's primary anxiety lay not in his foretold fate, but in that of his eventual successor. The War Master recognized that there would more than likely be infighting amongst the Lords militant. He knew the crusade could not afford to be riven with internal dispute, and that it would take a strong leader to capitalize on a great victory. Sladeau's body was laid to rest with full honours on Balhaut, housed in a large mausoleum known as the Honorarium. As for the forces of the archenemy, fortunately most of the Archon's brutal magisters perished during the vicious fighting on Balhaut, though there were some lamentable exceptions. Most notably, Magisters Scholenskara and Heritor Asphodel lived to pose future threats to the Crusade forces. Skara and a large contingent of his kith followers managed to successfully escape the purging fires on Balhaut. Skara's fate was unknown several standard years after Nadzibar's death at the hands of War Master Sladeau. For his part, the Heritor managed to evade Imperial ground forces and succeeded in escaping his fate. His ultimate fate would be unknown for a few Terran years until he later revealed himself on the hive world of Vergust. Apart from the forces that had fled Balhaut, many more archenemy forces that had been en route to reinforce the beleaguered forces of the Archon diverted or withdrew when word reached them of the disastrous defeat. The inner quadrants of the newfound trailing region suffered terribly, as many worlds in the region were either sacked or outright destroyed. Almost as many worlds were caught up in the aftermath of the enemy retreat, including Sapientia, Vergast, Aexi Cardinal, Lamicia, Erasmaeus, Unaida, and Cochiaminus. Eventually, many of these planets were reconquered and saved from their unendurable suffering and hardships, though not before many Imperial lives had been either corrupted or lost. War Master Makaroth, the year 765 of the 41st millennium. The dying Sladeau appointed the young Marshal Makaroth to be his successor as War Master. This appointment by the dying War Master brooked no argument from the Lords Militant, but Cybon, Hector Dravera, and others were incensed at Slado's decision, regarding the newly appointed War Master as too young and too junior. A period of bitter political infighting ensued, but Makaroth managed to cling to his rightful position as the newly appointed senior commander of the Crusade. By refusing to be cowed by the more senior officers, Makaroth displayed early on that he possessed the talent to outplay his rivals politically and that he had the ideal temperament for the role. In the solar decade since the Balhaut campaign, War Master Makaroth came to be regarded as one of the foremost military commanders of his time, standing upon the shoulders of his noble predecessor and using the solid gains of the early days of the Crusade as a springboard towards further imperial victories. Perhaps this is what Slado had recognized in the young commander when deciding on a suitable successor. Makaroth would continue to display, from the very beginning of his war mastery, his brilliant military tactics, intuitive intellect, instincts, and willingness to take risks, especially with his extraordinary prosecution of the Cabal Salient campaign. Cabal Salient, the years 765-773 of the 41st millennium. Just like his noble predecessor, the young War Master fixed on a primary objective that would take a considerable length of time to achieve. But, unlike Slado, Makaroth's objective was not merely one world but a greater portion of a planetary system, the Cabal systems. The War Master's commitment of Imperial forces to such a monumental undertaking was considered too ambitious and impossible to achieve by his detractors. Makaroth took heavy criticism from his peers for not consolidating Imperial forces after their victory on Balhaut, but there is numerous evidence to support that consolidation of forces was his primary aim. The young War Master just chose to do so in a different way than how Slado might have done it. Makaroth didn't wish to waste valuable time and manpower cleansing the remnants of the scattered components of the enemy, but rather strike at their center. The War Master knew that by ordering a bold thrust forward, they could capitalize on the weakness of enemies' hasty withdrawal, thereby taking the initiative away from the arch-enemy instead of laboriously trying to tie up loose ends. This would set the arch-enemy forces on their heels, effectively making it impossible for them to gather at one point and consolidate their forces. Makaroth hoped to drive right into the heart of the enemy by orchestrating a bold thrust that none of the scattered enemy forces could predict nor rally against. Intuitively, he knew that by being unpredictable, he would be able to strike at the head of the enemy and effectively end their stranglehold on the system. Therefore, Makaroth ordered the Crusade to drive across two major system groups to the threshold of the Cabal systems to achieve this bold new objective. The Crusade began its massive spinward advance at the close of the year 765 of the 41st millennium, invading and liberating worlds across the newfound trailing group, with separate actions taking place as far rimward as Nonimax and the Menazoid clasp, and as far coreward as Nasodon. Nonimax would be one of the first planets to be assaulted under Makaroth's leadership. The prosecution of this campaign under the War Master's brilliant leadership enabled the deployed Imperial Guard units to achieve reconquest in only 6 weeks. Another success came on the world of Grimoire, where the preliminary stages of fighting had begun a year prior to Balhaut and ground down to virtual halt. Makaroth handed the command of the theatre to the brilliant but later disgraced Lord General Nokesh Sturm. Commanding the Royal Volpone 50th Imperial Regiment, Lord General Sturm quickly delivered an accomplished victory within a single solar week. Makaroth used mobility as his primary strategy, rapidly deploying battlefield troops of regimental strength onto each target world, and then moving them onto the next target world with all speed as soon as the target world was firmly under control of second echelon occupying forces. These hit-and-run tactics enabled the most experienced and effective battlefield veterans within the Crusade to move swiftly from one theatre to the next. Between 765 and 769 of the 41st millennium, it was not an uncommon occurrence for Astra Militarum units to have seen combat on 8 or more worlds. This vigorous four-year advance saw the liberation of multiple worlds: Presarius, Sapientia, Monthax, Prince Obernid, Voltimand, Albrecht, and Fortis Binary. The most notable of these liberations took place on the world of Presarius by the Indomitable Iron Snakes chapter, adding another victory tally already won during the Crusade. The Iron Snakes acquitted themselves well by forcing battle with a partly mechanized mutant underclass in the tectonic foundries under the main hive cities. Cut off twice from Imperial lines of supply by enemy action and eventually exhausting their ammunition supply, the Iron Snakes resorted to vicious hand-to-hand fighting against their foes. This battle lasted for 9 solar days, resulting in nearly all the mutants being annihilated, with only the loss of 39 battle brothers. Master Vigum of the Silver Guard honoured the courage and fortitude shown by the Iron Snakes by having his own marines bow bareheaded to the valiant Iron Snakes upon their return. Disaster at Parthenope, 767 of the 41st millennium. Inevitably, other actions did not fare so well for the Imperial forces of the Crusade, most notably the disaster that befell the Emperor's servants on the fiercely contested world of Parthenope. One of Archon Nadzibar's most notorious magisters, Cooks of the Eyeless, was the architect of this crushing defeat. After the flight from Balhaut, Cooks had reconsolidated his forces on Parthenope. The Imperial force sent General Onotor, commanding 20 divisions, to re-secure the world. Magister Cooks ordered a feint and made it appear that his forces were collapsing under the initial Imperial assault. Coaxing the Imperial troops into an advance across the Catarad highlands, the Magister's forces then encircled and outflanked Onotor's troops. Onotor was beset from all sides and attempted to withdraw his forces. The ultimate fate that befell Onotor and his remaining men has been suppressed by the Inquisition for morale reasons. Emboldened by this bloody triumph, Magister Cook sent out his warships and pursued to destruction the components of the Crusade fleet that had brought the hapless Onotor and his allies to Parthenope. This was the third largest single fleet engagement of the campaign to date, resulting in a total victory for the forces of Chaos. The outcome of this large fleet action created the vast Antioch debris field, which remains a sad memorial to the fallible human weakness of hubris. A new Archon and the Blood Pact, 771, 772 of the 41st millennium. Initially, the Imperial forces had achieved several victories in 770 of the 41st millennium, but by 771 of the 41st millennium, the entire offensive into the Cabal systems came to a halt as the Crusade encountered not only stiff resistance, but hostile counterstrikes from Chaos forces. Inevitably, despite infighting, the Chaos host eventually selected a new leader from amongst their malefic host, the Archon Urlock Gar. Unfortunately, the rise of this new Chaos Overlord coincided with the Crusade's advance into the Cabal systems. The new Archon injected a new motivation into the arch-enemy's forces. Gifted in the application of military strategy, Archon Gar was able to centralize his tactics and properly orchestrate his forces' efforts against the encroaching Crusade forces. The new Archon proved to be a formidable opponent, robust and savage, and unimaginatively brutal in his tactics and approach to warfare. The impetus of the Archon Gar's strength was the supremely able fighting force known as the Blood Pact, whose methodology was ultimately modelled on that of the Astra Militarum itself. As the Archon's strength had grown, his influence quickly spread to other worlds, with his bodyguard force spearheading his conquering armies. From these vassal worlds, their numbers were recruited, and the bodyguard grew, becoming an army in its own right. This was how the Blood Pact was spawned. The first notice given of Urlock Gar to Imperial forces was when he led a series of lightning raids along the coreward fringe of the Khan group in the middle of 771 of the 41st millennium. Within the Cabal system itself, more strenuous resistance was encountered, along with the first reports of the emerging forces of the Blood Pact. A more profound attack took place less than a solar month later. The Imperial forces initially believed that the forces of the enemy were being led by a particularly militant magister, but it soon became painfully clear that they were dealing with someone who was far more dangerous and deadly. This unidentified leader had the ability to call upon vast reserves of arch-enemy troops and mobilize other potent magisters under his command. There was no doubt, however, that by 772 of the 41st millennium, Urlok Gar was the new Archon of the arch-enemy forces. Within a drastically short period, 3 key dangers had manifested, haunting Makaroth's carefully laid plans. A new Archon had risen to unify the enemy. He had mounted a wounding counterstrike against the Crusade fleet's flank, and the overstretched flank was woefully exposed. Makaroth's overreaching push had left the Crusade painfully vulnerable on 3 sides, which the new Archon attempted to exploit to the fullest. The War Master quickly redeployed a significant portion of his forces to protect his forces' vulnerable flanks in a last-ditch effort to reopen supply lines. Between the end of 771 of the 41st millennium and the middle part of 772 of the 41st millennium, Imperial commanders conducted desperate ad hoc operations to secure multiple target worlds in an effort to keep the Crusade alive. Only at the world of Ariadne did any of these attempts fail. As these worlds were reconquered, Makaroth attempted to renew his forward thrust into the Cabal systems. The Archon had withdrawn into the Carcharodon cluster to the fortress world of Morland to mass his forces for a large-scale counterattack. The War Master wanted to desperately break past Morland to confront Gar, but knew that he was still obligated to defend the Cabal salient. The Archon left his most capable magisters in charge of his forces to continue prosecuting their attack on the Crusade's coreward flank. These vile lieutenants included the likes of Anakwana Ck, Shebel Redhand, and Enoch Inokenti. The Brink, 773 of the 41st millennium. Subdivided, hard-pressed and overstretched, the Imperial forces were now into their 18th year of the Crusade campaign. The fortress world of Morland continued to prove to be a thorn in the War Master's side, stubbornly holding out against Makaroth's assault. By this time, much of the Crusade's forces were spread thin, fighting simultaneous actions across the Khan group and the trailward half of the Cabal systems. The coreward flank continued to be harried by arch-enemy forces conducting counter-strike raids. If these raids couldn't be halted outright, the rising intensity of the raids would eventually spell disaster for the Crusade. The War Master Makaroth's forces risked being split in half, with the War Master himself and a greater portion of the Imperial forces cut off and surrounded. They would then be annihilated by the arch-enemy. Aware of the inherent dangers of remaining overstretched, Makaroth eventually decided to remain as he was, and in one last effort, to continue to fight on to take Morland and the Cabal systems. The Khan Group, 775 of the 41st millennium. In the third quarter of the year, 773 of the 41st millennium, 2 of Archon Urlok Gar's magisters, Enoch Inokenti and Anakwana Ck, launched a 2-pronged flank attack into the Khan Group that would be both murderous and catastrophic for the Crusade forces. Their goal was simple: to bisect the Crusade force and decapitate it. Though disaster and defeat loomed during this time of the most desperate warfare of the Crusade, there also came a miracle or two. But by the end of 773 of the 41st millennium, these 2 magisters had all but halted the Imperial thrust in the Cabal systems, slicing across the Imperial realm and successfully bisecting the Khan Group. The Imperial losses, both military and civilian, were incalculable. 3 worlds were savaged to near extinction, and another 3 had their ecosystems permanently altered, creating nuclear winters. This is not even taking into account the number of people consumed by penalty camps and murder centres established by the encroaching arch-enemy forces. During this phase of the Crusade, many worlds within the zone found themselves fighting alone. Only sheer happenstance combined with successful unilateral actions eventually saved Imperial interests, rather than any sort of overall strategy. 3 theatres proved pivotal in favouring the fortune of the Imperial armies, including Khan III, Herodor, and Enothis. Enothis, the years 773 to 774 of the 41st millennium. Upon the world of Enothis, Lord Militant Humel found himself facing the full intensity of Magister Anaquanar Sek's invading forces. Outnumbered and outmatched, Humel made a tactical withdrawal northwards across the interior desert. Knowing that his forces could be obliterated before they had the chance to regroup, resupply and rearm themselves, Humel made brilliant use of Imperial air power. Taking sage advice from the Admiral in charge of Imperial air power on the planet, they turned the ground war into an air war, which helped deny the enemy approach and protect the beleaguered land forces fleeing northwards. The war finally culminated in the most elaborate air battle of the entire Sabbat Crusade to date, on the 270th day of the year 773 of the 41st millennium. Suffering large-scale losses, the arch-enemy forces' advance eventually faltered. By early 774 of the 41st millennium, Magister Saek had fled the planet. Humel had shown that through valor and determination, the Chaos attack could be repulsed. Khan III, the years 773 to 775 of the 41st millennium. On Khan III, Lord General Bulladin, the most cautious and focused of all within Makaroth's senior staff, found himself pitted against the forces of Magister Shebal Redhand, a notorious monster who left a trail of burning worlds in his murderous wake. Fortunately for the Imperials, Redhand lacked organization and discipline, a fact that the Lord General would take full advantage of when their forces clashed. Supported by two separate armoured brigades, Bulladin forced an opening in the arch-enemy's lines, then sent foot companies from two Astra Militarum regiments to flank Redhand's forces. Panicking, the Magister drew his forces closer to him. A heavy tank battle soon ensued, and Bulladin quickly pressed in with 3 battalions of troopers with Titan support. Magister Shebal fled to the highlands and soon found himself surrounded by an armoured brigade commanded by the Lord General himself. Though allegorical tales tell of how Bulladin met and slew Shebal in personal combat, many regard these tales as speculation and hearsay. What matters is that the vile Magister met his ultimate fate upon that high ground and was killed. Though the Lord General had achieved a major victory, enemy forces would continue to harangue the Imperials for the next 22 solar months of intense fighting. Herodor, the turning point, the year 773 of the 41st millennium. Though the battle for Herodor was a much smaller scale operation compared to such significant clashes as the one on the world of Enothis, its importance cannot be undervalued. Herodor is agreed by Imperial scholars and strategists to be the turning point for the fortunes of the Crusade. The planet's only claim to significance was that it was one of the holy worlds visited by St. Sabbat Beati during her original crusade within the region millennia earlier. The planet was of no great tactical significance, yet Magister Enoch Innocenti chose to lead the assault there personally, perhaps in an effort to prevent the miracle that was to occur. Commanded by Lord General Lugo, an Astra Militarum force supported by the local PDF occupied the sacred balneary shrine and religious centre of the principal city of Civitas Beati in order to defend it from attack. Reliable information in regards to what occurred during the assault remains unclear, with the exception of the early stages of the attack. A young, raven-haired Esholi woman born on Hagia emerged from the imperial citizenry, claiming to be the reincarnated saint who had also originated on Hagia, though the validity of this was initially called into question by Lugo's detractors at the time, as some claimed she was merely an actress selected to play the part by Lugo in order to boost imperial morale. However, it now appears that the extraordinary truth of the matter is far more interesting. Whatever her mysterious origins, this unidentified girl took on the mantle of the Beati and for all intents and purposes became the beloved Saint Sabbat. Exhibiting powers and abilities beyond the normal ken of average mortals, this living saint inspired the imperial forces, stirring their resolve with her holy presence. The beloved Saint Sabbat Beati had been reborn on Herodor, close to the end of the year 773 of the 41st millennium, to the eternal glory of the Emperor of mankind. Some suggest that through some arcane means, Innocenti had foreseen this and may have attempted to prevent it from occurring. The imperial forces rallied around the living saint, engaging Innocenti's foul host at the Civitas Beati. A vicious battle ensued as the saint and her army routed the arch-enemy forces and slew the wicked magister. This coincided with the War Master Makaroth's victory, which had finally resolved on the fortress world of Moorland. This enabled Makaroth to deploy part of his forces in support of the Khan group's beleaguered so-called Second Front. Had Innocenti not been halted by the fight on Herodor, his advance would have most likely pushed forwards and eventually have finished the job of fatally decapitating the Crusade line. The timing of the victory on Herodor could not have been more perfect. The forces of the arch-enemy had faltered, their morale shattered and their spirit broken. The Magisters had ultimately failed where it really mattered, as the calamitous effect of their defeats spoiled their carefully strategized maneuver. Soon the news of the reborn saint spread amongst the ranks of the Crusade, inspiring their impetus to drive forwards and deny the Archon's minions. Only the forces of Magister Anwar CK managed to maintain any type of solid cohesion in the face of these imperial victories. SEK was possibly the most gifted strategist in the Sabbat worlds in the service of the ruinous powers. There were even troubling intelligence reports reaching Makaroth that SEK was building his own army to rival the Blood Pact, the sons of SEK. At this critical juncture in the Crusade, War Master Makaroth redeployed several of his most experienced subordinates, including Lord Militant Cybon and Marshal Blackwood, to seemingly unimportant theatres at the rear or the flanks of the Crusade's advance. His reasons for doing so were not clear. His critics said that he was pushing members of the Old Guard aside to give his own favourites the chance to win glory. However, it was equally possible that the War Master was anticipating another flanking attack of the kind that had such disastrous effect in the Cabal systems and the Khan group, and was sending his best subordinates to where they would do the most good. The newly established Second Front in the Khan group soon began its thrust forwards to drive through its opposition and finally protect the vulnerable flanks of the Crusade forces, with the War Master's stubborn assault on the fortress world of Moorland finally succeeding at the close of the year 773 of the 41st millennium. As of the year 775 of the 41st millennium, an imperial victory within the Sabbat world sector appeared to be nearly inevitable. The Second Front. By the year 778 of the 41st millennium, the Sabbat world's crusade was now entering a defining phase in its 23rd standard year, having successfully advanced into the highly contested territories of the Cabal systems and beginning to make significant headway into the Carcharodon cluster. This hostile region was considered to be the heartland of the forces of chaos within the Sabbat worlds. Overall, imperial victory was believed by the Crusade's high command to be achievable in as little as 5 standard years. However, there were those who cautioned against the folly of hubris, fearing that a number of factors could just as easily prove disastrous for the Crusade's ultimate success. Over the course of more than 2 solar decades of fighting, the fortunes of the Imperium during the Crusade had reversed on more than one occasion. There were 2 factors that could hamper imperial efforts to achieve total victory in the sector. First, the fighting within the Cabal and Carcharodon regions was on a scale unseen. Secondly, the Khan group was still beset by the forces of the arch-enemy, many of which were attempting to effect a counterstrike. In his haste, War Master Makaroth left many unresolved conflicts in his wake. Those commanders on the Second Front were left to handle the arch-enemy forces and win at any cost, preventing them from driving at the flank of the crusading forces. Lyubov War, the year 778 of the 41st millennium. The world of Lyubov was considered a strategically useful location on one of the main jump routes, and was also believed to be a source of fuel, munitions, and other consumables for the arch-enemy forces within the Khan group. Lyubov had effectively been conquered in the year 750 of the 41st millennium, suffering under the occupation of the archenemy for 2.5 solar decades. Several hive cities still managed to remain under imperial control for the majority of the time, with major wars being waged on the ground as a result. Lord Militant Sabbat ordered Lyubov to be retaken in late the year 777 of the 41st millennium, giving responsibility to General Andreas Karnhide. General Karnhide was a veteran Astra Militarum commander with a prestigious and long military career that predated the start of the Crusade in the Sabbat worlds. Serving under the former War Master Slado during the Kulan War, the years 752 to 754 of the 41st millennium, Karnhide had risen as one of the War Masters chosen to ascend to the command echelon at the beginning of hostilities. Prior to the Lyubov campaign, Karnhide's service during the Crusade remained unglamorous, as circumstances often found him commanding deployment garrisons or forces in transit. After the death of Slado in the year 765 of the 41st millennium, like many of his contemporaries, Karnhide found himself fallen out of favour with the new War Master. With nothing to prove in terms of loyalty and ability, many veteran commanders such as Karnhide found themselves relegated to the onerous chores associated with Second Front command. General Karnhide was not selected for the job of liberating Lyubov on merit, but rather circumstance. Lord Militant Sabbat tasked the only senior officer he felt he could spare, as the Khan group was overstretched and beset by 3 significant conflicts. Though he was given command of a sizable liberation army, they were an ad hoc formation comprised of disparate units who had not served together operationally. Many of these units had seen significant service on the front for an excessive amount of time and desperately needed to be retired and restated. Sabbat more than likely used the general's task force as a stopgap measure to keep Lyubov busy until such a time when the Lord Militant could eventually claim victory for himself. Sabbat greatly misunderstood the threat level on Lyubov, which would eventually prove to be worse than anyone suspected. A new kind of enemy. The forces of chaos arrayed against General Andreas Karnhide on Lyubov were significant. Within the occupied zones there were substantial chaos cult armies and levies of forcibly conscripted citizens from the indigenous population that had been tainted by the touch of the warp. They occupied the transcontinental nexus, a heavy populated zone where the bulk of the planet's hive cities and manufactoria lay. These forces were augmented by numerous war machines, armor, aircraft, corrupted Chaos Titans, and even a considerable number of traitor Chaos Space Marines. The Chaos Army was further supplemented with the deadly and ferocious clan army of the Blood Pact. These forces of the archenemy were commanded by a being known as Araek Etogor. Imperial scholars believe that the name Etogor is a rank of honorific meaning sub or demigod, perhaps denoting an equivalent rank comparable to colonel or general. This capable and charismatic leader had forged the usually disparate force of chaos into a unit of command, making the archenemy occupation force into a singular, coherent structure. This is what awaited the Imperial forces on Lyubov. Liberation of Lyubov. Planning the successful liberation of Lyubov was a difficult undertaking, for the bulk of the separate fronts considered for a mass drop assault were too active and defensible. 19 separate plans for the initial assault were rejected by General Karnhide and his planners, including the strategic points of Sredi Bay, Zinc Hill and Kazenberg. Principal assault of Lyubov was deemed unfeasible so long as these outer hive cities were still active. Having obtained a substantial amount of useful intelligence on the Nexus Zone, most objections to these various drop-point plans were made by Karnhide's infantry commanders. This was mainly due to the considerable air coverage from the archenemy's interceptor squadrons. These hunter-killer squadrons were hard to track and kill from orbit, for they were based upon mobile land carriers that made it all but impossible to track their whereabouts. The substantial number of enemy fighters would make any drop assault an extremely risky proposition, whilst the large formations of enemy stoop bombers would swiftly annihilate any Imperial forces that managed to somehow make it to the surface intact. Considering his options carefully, Karnhide posed the problem to his Imperial Navy officers. The general initially wanted the fleet commanders to bring their ships into a much tighter and lower orbit, from which they would be able to more accurately target these land carriers. But the Navy officers were unwilling to risk their line ships against the range of the arch-enemy's huge anti-orbital batteries. Instead, they devised a daring but risk-worthy plan of their own. Flight Marshal Khaled Haydun of the Aeronautica Imperialis presented an audacious plan to send 8 massed waves of Imperial fighters ahead of the troop drop to engage the enemy aircraft head-to-head for air superiority. Though normally such a bold tactic would be frowned upon by most commanders of the fleet, their subordinate pilot officers saw merit, relishing the notion of such a challenge. In this particular theatre, the commanders of the major vessels were willing to risk their fighters rather than their main vessels. An accord was reached by the various commanders, and with the blessing of General Karnhide, the plan was approved. Air War Phase. The massed waves of Aeronautica Imperialis fighters, made up predominantly of thunderbolts but also including some wings of lightnings, began to attack at 0 hour on day 1. This phase included a large, full-scale air battle that involved almost 30,000 Imperial aircraft and some 45,000 enemy warplanes. At the height of the engagement, nearly 63,000 Imperial warplanes would be committed overall. Sredi Bay, Bulk Cliff Hive, and the Zinc Hill regions were the principal attack zones, with the most intense air battles being fought on the first and third solar days of the operation over Sredi Bay, and on day 4 at Zinc Hill. In the second solar week of the air war, a 9-hour engagement ensued over the coastal zone at Bulk Cliff Hive. By the third solar week of the air war, the forces of Chaos's air power had been greatly reduced to only a third of its starting strength. Lyubov was now vulnerable to a full-scale Imperial ground assault with the loss of its defenders' air support. After over 2 solar weeks of air combat, the forces of Chaos were well aware that the Imperium was about to launch a massive ground assault and prepared accordingly for the fight to come. Ground Assault Phase. The land war was now ready to commence. And even though the air was clear for a full-scale orbital drop assault, the Astra Militarum was once again resistant to the general. Karnhide understood their reluctance, and instead of ordering them to attack, he showed intuitive understanding that the answer to his problems lay with the forces of the Adeptus Mechanicus and their mighty war machines, the Titans. Carefully formed by Warmaster Slado at the inception of the Crusade, the Mechanicus had entered into cooperative pacts for the tentative use of their war machines. Though invaluable, the Mechanicus was an organization that was prone to act autonomously, with a reluctance to be commanded by a Crusade general. The priests of Mars continued to show their displeasure with the progress of the Crusade, enduring the hardships that it entailed longer than led to expect by the former Warmaster. They grew increasingly dissatisfied with having to provide ever greater quantities of their war machines. Makaroth had done little to appease the Mechanicus, and their forces assigned to the Second Front resented not being a part of the primary campaign. Karnhide possessed a reserve of over 130 Titans in his task force, the majority being the smaller Scout-grade Warhound-class Titans, and he knew that these war machines of the Mechanicus could break the arch-enemy's ground defences, opening the way for the Astra Militarum and its armour. Spending solar hours in carefully orchestrated talks with the senior adepts of the Mechanicus assigned to the Crusade, Karnhide reasoned that the Warmaster sought triumph and glory, and those units that exhibited the most courage and zeal would more than likely be summoned by Makaroth to the front lines where the true glory lay. Karnhide promised the Mechanicus that if he garnered their full support, he would send directly to the Warmaster reports of the ground assault on Lyubov being led by Mechanicus forces. The very next day, the Mechanicus led the assault on 3 target zones: Sredi Bay, Bulk Cliff Hive and Zinc Hill. Long-range orbital bombardment and carpet bombing preceded the Titan landings. Instead of dropping in and then advancing on the target, the Titans landed and radiated from the landing zone. At Zinc Hill and Sradiv, large areas of territory were cleared in this way. 23 solar hours after the successful Titan operation deployment, the Astra Militarum forces mobilized en masse in a full-scale drop assault composed of 2.6 million troops in the first wave. The Imperial Guard targeted the 3 main zones that the Titans had already cleared of the defences of Archenemy forces. A 4th drop force, predominantly comprised of regiments of Carnelian Lightfoot, targeted Kazenberg Hive, successfully wrested control of the automatic defences and swiftly brought it back into use by Imperial occupation forces. Though it was the 2nd largest hive city on the planet, the Guard force managed to take Kazenberg the fastest and most easily, with the least collateral damage. Zinc Hill was another matter entirely, as it soon proved to be the toughest of the targets to conquer. Being the most resistant to the Mechanicus's Titan assault, they still retained some air cover, using it to their advantage. Advancing under armour support, the 2nd wave of Astra Militarum troops advanced upon the subsidiary hive city. As the Imperial forces attempted to storm the western wall of the main hive, a massive battle erupted. The arch-enemy deployed many bizarre engines of destruction, shredding both troops and body armour with thereto unknown mechanised heavy mortars that spat high-velocity razor chaff. Fortunately, these weapons proved to not be durable, as they were soon destroyed by the Guard's field batteries and their sustained heavy bombardments. It took 3 solar days of constant warfare to finally breach the western wall. Invading the outer ring of the hive city, the Astra Militarum force soon encountered a concealed and dug-in enemy force and their nightmarish ditchwork of trenches and foxholes. Vicious trench warfare ensued for another 2 solar days, until the Imperial Titan Vainglory Tumultus was brought in to clear the way. The ground forces sustained a high number of casualties. Chaotic street fighting soon ensued, as the Astra Militarum were continuously harangued by poorly armed Chaos Cult zealots. Karnhide wisely rendered command in the field to those officers on the ground who would be able to make split-second decisions to deal with the fluctuating threat as the situation dictated. After further investigation, it was revealed that the difficulties faced by Imperial forces were due to the fact that Arek Etogar had made his base of operations at Zinc Hill. The arch-enemy forces had acted accordingly, making this site one of ritual importance, defending it with fanatical vigour. Etogar may have been present at the time of the Imperial invasion, and the vigorous defence put up by arch-enemy forces was used to bide him time to escape and flee to Ljuboviv. With the successful pacification of the southern portion of the transcontinental nexus, Karnhide's attention next turned to the gigantic main hive city of Ljuboviv. As the majority of all existing enemy resistance had retreated to this veritable fortress, Karnhide knew this objective represented numerous problems for his overall strategy. In the years of chaos occupation, the forces of the arch-enemy had turned the hive city into a nearly impervious fortress with a heavily armoured outer structure, while also embellishing it with innumerable gun emplacements and malevolent anti-personnel devices. The ancillary hive cities of Zenik and Zevin that lay to the west also proved to be a problem, as these 2 hives fed primary power reserves into Ljuboviv. An overlapping system of defensive trenches, dikes and armour traps lay to the south and southwest, constructed in a wide crescent many hundred of kilometres long and partly mined. It would be a major chore just to get to the main hive. Karnhide's senior staff offered numerous conflicting schemes regarding how to best take the formidable Ljuboviv. Instead of choosing a single plan of attack, the general once again displayed keen insight and remarkable fluidity of thinking by deciding to embark upon a simultaneous 3-pronged assault that incorporated all of these various plans. Though this was seen as indecision by his peers at the time, Imperial history would later vindicate Karnhide. Dividing his forces into 6 separate armies, the general also divided his commanders to lead their respective forces and carry out the various plans that each commander had recommended. Led by Major General Arkol, The First Army would maintain a firm occupation of the areas already taken, providing a slow siege of the main hive city to wait the enemy out and standing in reserve if necessary. The Second Army, mostly composed of motorized light infantry, was to be commanded by Colonel Yak. His forces were also to be kept in a reserve and support position outside Sradiv, ready to deploy at a moment's notice. Karnhide himself would command the Third Army and commence a frontal assault on Lyuboviv, cutting a patch through the defensive system. Under the command of General Doshin, the Fourth Army would encircle Lyuboviv around the eastern fringe and attack from the northeast sector. Such a plan had been recommended by Doshin. The Fifth and Sixth Armies would be composed of smaller motorized forces commanded by Colonel Paquin and Colonel Vansetter, respectively. Their primary objectives were the ancillary hive cities, with the Fifth Army severing communications with the main hive, while the Sixth Army struck at Zevin and Zenik simultaneously. Using his superb diplomatic skills and a bit of guile, Karnhide once again made use of the Imperial Navy and Adeptus Mechanicus forces to help his overall strategy succeed. He manipulated the two separate organizations by insinuating that he would hate to see them robbed of their share of the climactic glory by the Astra Militarum forces on the ground. The Mechanicus immediately seconded their war machines and Titans to the Third and Fourth Armies, while the Imperial Navy's Aeronautica Imperialis would conduct precision airstrikes on the coastal power farms of the ancillary hives. They would then provide air cover for the Fifth and Sixth Armies. Colonels Paquin and Vansetter initiated the attack by striking deep at the southern side of Zevin and Zenik. Paquin's Fifth Army succeeded in cutting all communications with Lyuboviv by severing the mass transit and cable links within a single day, then turned west towards Zenik. The Navy did its part by reducing the power farms to smoking craters with its deadly air power. The Sixth Army managed to break into the southern side of Zevin, but the advance soon ground to a halt after facing ferocious resistance. The Astra Militarum soon came face to face with significant numbers of the Blood Pact for the first time since the invasion began. On the move for the better part of 3 solar days, Major General Doshin's Fourth Army swung around to assault the northeastern margin of the main hive. They were soon met by huge numbers of enemy armor, composed principally of units of the Blood Pact armed with captured and customized Imperial battle tanks. An enormous armor battle soon erupted on the northeastern plains. Meanwhile, the large Third Army force commanded by General Karnhide dug a path through the rudimentary but deadly defense system erected by the arch-enemy. Fortunately, the strength of the Mechanicus' war machines served them well by destroying and clearing these lethal defenses, losing 2 Titans in the process, but ensuring that by the end of the first day, the outer walls of the hive city were in sight. In spite of this success, Karnhide soon received negative reports of the Sixth Army being fought to a standstill by Blood Pact forces and the Fourth Army being pushed back and slaughtered. Pleading for support from the reserves, both commanders were refused by Karnhide. Though his decision was viewed as cold and heartless, Karnhide knew he could not spare them, for he would soon need the reserves to reinforce his main assault. Though he wanted to support the efforts of his beleaguered officers, he had full confidence in both commanders to accomplish their individual objectives. In less than 24 solar hours, his confidence was rewarded. Colonel Vansetter managed to launch a thrust into the Blood Pact forces, driving them back about 3 kilometers into Zevin. Moving with all speed, Colonel Paquin moved in to support the Sixth Army in a counterstrike, bringing the Fifth Army into a pincer movement on the Blood Pact's vulnerable left flank. The Navy air wings heavily supported their efforts, attacking both the Blood Pact in Zevan and key positions within the hive city. It would take 9 more solar days of fierce warfare before a conclusive Imperial victory could be claimed against the ancillary hives, with exceedingly high casualties as a result of their troubles. General Doshin redoubled his efforts on the northeastern front, bolstered by the news that the Blood Pact was not as invincible as their reputation suggested. He then ran the heavy armour and Titans in his command into a long, tight angle of attack across the hydroelectric valleys of the East Liube River. Battalions of light support and anti-tank units were simultaneously directed in an encircling manoeuvre around to the north. Soon, a second fierce tank battle erupted, but the general's gambit proved to be successful. The blood-packed war machines fell back and attempted to reform into a cohesive force, but many soon found themselves easy targets for the advancing Imperial armour and were destroyed before they could reassemble. Forced to retreat towards the flanks of the main hive city, the blood-packed armour broke into two distinct elements. The first was annihilated by advancing Warhound Scout Titans and tank destroyers outside the main eastern gate. The other element soon faced the encircling light support battalions, which picked them off at their leisure, breaking their cohesiveness as an effective fighting force. The light support and tank destroyers continued to pick off the last of the Blood Pact's war engines as Doshan's main force advanced to assault the outer defences of Ljubovive. Karnhide's Third Army broke past the defence systems, crossing the outer road networks near the main hive itself, just as they received word that Doshan's forces began their assault. Taking heavy fire from the gun emplacements and hard points that studded the hive's outer perimeter, the Imperial drive started to falter under the relentless barrage. Even the Imperial commissars balked at the prospect of advancing into the deadly barrage of cannon fire, batteries, lasfire and flamers. But the Imperials hardened their resolve and drove forward into the heart of the enemy. General Karnhide's Third Army penetrated the southwestern perimeter of Ljubovive in the early hours of the campaign's 17th solar day. Ferocious urban fighting ensued, as the arch-enemy countered the Imperial assault with a well-orchestrated resistance meeting them at every step of the way. Karnhide was soon forced to call in support from the Second Army sooner than he had anticipated. The brutal fighting ensued unabated for the next 80 solar hours. News of Doshan's forces breaching the main hive perimeter in the northeast and also driving in towards the hive city's core reached them 46 solar hours into that period. Though the general's spirits were lifted by the good news, his hopes were soon dashed as the Blood Pact once again proved to be an implacable foe that fought with stealth and guile. For every small victory and every inch of ground taken, the Blood Pact made the Imperials pay dearly, laying traps, setting ambushes, mining tenements and employing snipers and booby traps. After 80 solar hours of continuous fighting, Karnhide finally relented and called a halt, allowing the frontline forces to retire and be replaced. The fighting dulled somewhat for a short period of time, but at hour 85, Karnhide pressed his forces onwards. Endgame. As the Imperials made a furious thrust into the wounded hive city, they encountered fewer blood-packed forces at this latter stage and more levies of chaos cultists. A great fire soon broke out in the main hive city's northern sectors, burning unchecked until 1/5 of the hive was consumed. It is speculated that this fire was the result of stray munitions, but was more likely caused by enemy sabotage. Karnhide focused on his main goal of finding and destroying the focus of Lyubov resistance, Arek Etogar. He drove his forces relentlessly forwards, knowing full well that victory was within his grasp. Late on the 73rd solar day of the campaign, 3 fire teams from the 82nd Carnelian Lightfoot finally ran the Etogor to ground. Driving ahead of the main advance, the fire teams encountered unexpected resistance from a squad of blood-packed warriors. A firefight ensued, which left 3 of the foes dead on the causeway outside and forced the remainder of the enemy to back down into a vandalized sensorium. Checking for signs of life, the Imperial medic noticed the dead foes weren't attired like the average blood-packed warrior. Alarmed by this unusual turn of events, the squad leader soon alerted command for support. The fire teams soon found themselves under renewed fire from the sensorium before any support could arrive. They encountered stiff resistance from all quarters, but the Imperials valiantly fought on. By the time a squad of Kazakin specialists arrived to support the beleaguered fire teams, the squad leader believed he had spotted the rogue Etogor. He pursued him with 2 other members of his squad through the lower quad and towards the west door of the sensorium. Cornered, the Etogor drew a barbed chainsword, snarled like a cornered animal, and lunged to attack. His two subordinates were swiftly cut down, and the squad leader missed the Etugawa with his first two shots. With one charge in his weapon's power pack remaining, the squad leader fired one last time into the snarling face of his foe. Arek Etugawa was finally dead, though it later transpired that the squad leader had missed, and the headshot was claimed by one of the Kazakin marksmen in an adjacent building. The deed was done. Sporadic fighting continued for solar weeks afterwards, but eventually an Imperial victory was declared after the successful conclusion of the Lyubov campaign. Aftermath. From the very beginning of the Lyubov campaign, General Andreas Karnhide had numerous obstacles arrayed against him. He was given a poorly supplied and equipped ad hoc force of mixed units, and still managed to achieve what was thought to be an unlikely victory. Karnhide was a genius at understanding how to use the disparate parts of his command coherently, and his command allowed them to function at their best. He knew how to play to the strengths of the various organizations under his command and make them an asset, bringing out the best in his troops through respect for their opinions and initiative, even as the forces of chaos often did the opposite. General Karnhide should have achieved glory and honor in light of this great imperial victory, but alas, it was not to be. Though he would achieve his assigned objective and drive the Chaos forces from Lyubov, ending their threat to the advancement of the Crusade's front across the Sabbat world sector, General Karnhide was accused of wavering and indecision, with his peers casting doubts on his strength of character and even his ability to command, largely as an act of political vengeance orchestrated by Sabbat when it became clear that he had badly misjudged the situation on Lyubov. Lord Militant Sabbat even had the gall to berate Karnhide for allowing elements under his command to do as they will, which of course was the tactical flexibility that had allowed Karnhide to claim the victory in the first place. Karnhide was deeply wounded by this criticism. He eventually went on to publish his own account of the action at Lyubov and retired from the Crusade and Imperial military service altogether. 18 months later, he dies from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. Order of Battle of the Sabbat World's Crusade, Imperial Forces, Senior Commanders. In the extensive history of the Imperium, we encounter a group of esteemed leaders whose fates are intertwined with the struggles of war. Among them is War Master Slado, who was killed in action in the year 765 of the 41st millennium. Then there is War Master Makaroth, known for his strength and cunning, whose legacy remains. Lord Militant Sabbat served with unwavering resolve, while Lord Militant Delaney was recognized for his tactical skills. Lord Militant Hector Dravere met his end at Menazoid Epsilon, killed in action in the year 765 of the 41st millennium. Lord Militant Humil was a respected leader, inspiring many with his courage. Lord Militant Vicris was killed in action at Cochiaminus in the year 762 of the 41st millennium. Marshal Beza was a vigilant warrior of the Imperium, and Marshal Burns bravely fell at Balhaut, killed in action in the year 765 of the 41st millennium. Marshal Blackwood was known for his valour, while Marshal Philisa contributed significantly to many battles with his strategic insights. Marshal Hardiker remained resilient, and Marshal Kaita was recognised for his strong leadership. Lord General Bulletin played a crucial role in shaping history, and Lord General Kelso left a lasting impact with his distinguished service. Lord General Lugo was an experienced commander, respected by his men. Lord General Noches Sturme was branded excommunicate traitoris and executed for treachery in the year 774 of the 41st millennium. Lord General Uriens and Lord General Barthol van Voits were dedicated officers whose names carried weight. General Akensor stood firm in adversity, while General Jata Elbeth went missing in action at Fornax Aleph in the year 758 of the 41st millennium. General Dylan Belfry was killed in action at Ambold 11 in the year 756 of the 41st millennium. General Andreas Karnhide tragically ended his life in disgrace in the year 778 of the 41st millennium. General Carrel was incapacitated at Balhaut in the year 765 of the 41st millennium. later relieved by General Corson. General Dravera was highly regarded, and General Frederick earned respect among his peers. General Forbes had his command relieved by Lord Militant Vicris at Cochiaminus in the year 760 of the 41st millennium. General Grismond was a steady presence in the chaos of war. General Corson was killed in action at Balhaut in the year 765 of the 41st millennium, with command taken over by Marshal Burns. General Lemonsholtz, General Lucium and General Oliphant all displayed bravery in battle. General Onotor is presumed killed in action at Parthenope in the year 767 of the 41st millennium. The Inquisition has suppressed details about Onotor and his troops for morale reasons. General Salton was a dedicated officer, and General Scalia made invaluable contributions to the cause. General Uriens and General Barthol van Voits remained stalwarts of the Imperium. Finally, Colonel Begolin was executed by the Commissariat for incompetence during the Ambold 11 campaign in the year 756 of the 41st millennium. Chapters of the Adeptus Astartes: Imperial Fists, Iron Snakes, Raven Guard, Silver Guard, White Scars. There were 6 Astartes chapters that supported the Sabbat Worlds Crusade, but the last remains unlisted in current Imperial records. Known Astartes fleet elements: Antipathy, Strike Cruiser, Breakspear, Battle Barge. Imperial Guard regiments. Within the vast ranks of the Imperial Guard stands as a bulwark against the tides of chaos, comprising numerous regiments, each with its own history and valour. Among them is the 55th Arno Fast Attack, renowned for its motorised assaults. The 23rd Baldachian Fusiliers and the 26th Baldachian Fusiliers both faced utter annihilation at Parthenope in the year 767 of the 41st millennium. The Bale Highlanders, known for their fierce spirit, are a proud regiment, while the Baculian Levy Reserves, ready to defend the Imperium. The 301st Cadian specialises in reconnaissance, with the 82nd, 88th, 97th and 101st Carnelian Lightfoot regiments providing light infantry support. The 51st Chenovian serves alongside the 51st Chenovian armoured support, bringing heavy firepower to the battlefield. The 9th Clovis, known as the Indomitables, and the 11th Clovis heavy support are key components in mechanised warfare. The 676th Darag stands ready with its armoured units, while the 3rd de Vache contributes to the Imperium's might. The Eliter Heavy Support Regiment is renowned for its formidable firepower. The 112th Falstaff and the 8th Fortis Binars also lend their strength to the ongoing conflict. The 41st Farset Lancers, equipped for mechanised combat, and the 982nd Halomus, known as the Scythes, play significant roles in the Imperial campaigns. The 8th Hirken and 500th Iorgan, nicknamed the Golden Caps, are vital infantry forces, while the Jantine Patricians stand as a symbol of nobility. The 1st Karaklas and 86th Kasokin, a special operations unit, are well respected. The Quetzalc 18th, 21st and 22nd Regiments stand ready for action. The 2nd Coulon Huskars, known as Silver Kindred, and the Curvan Light Auxiliary provide additional support. The Kolstek 22nd, 29th and 477th Light Support units also bolster the Imperial ranks. The 21st Heavy Crassian is a formidable force, while the Latarii, or Gundogs, were annihilated at Lamicia in the year 767 of the 41st millennium. The 6th Marco and the Manth Grenadier regiments continue to hold their ground. The Mariner, 18th, known as Panthers, and the 2nd Mnenomite, which faced annihilation at Parthenope in the year 767 of the 41st millennium, are vital components of the Imperial military. The 11th Mordian Iron Guard, 45th Mercian and Narmenian regiments comprising the 1st Armoured, 2nd Heavy and 3rd provide crucial support in various capacities. The Ontanople Pioneers and Ontanople Rifles play essential roles in the Imperium's efforts. The Pardus 12th 8th Armoured and 34th Armoured units bring heavy armour to the battlefield, while the 19th Fantine Airborne, known as the Silent, makes its presence known from the skies. The 11th Paladin, Praga 6th, 10th, 13th, 20th and 46th Light Regiments contribute their strength to the cause. the 58th Rakonin Lass Company, Rhone Deepers, 56th Rigol Centurions, and 81st St. Coran all stand ready to defend the Imperium. The 88th St. Coran and the 77th Salazar Pike, known as the Shakos, are also vital forces. The Samothrace 4th Regiment faced annihilation at Parthenope in the year 767 of the 41st millennium, while the Samothrace 9th and 303rd continue their efforts. The 8th, 9th and 11th Sankon Light Regiments provide additional infantry support. The 21st Sarpoi and 142nd Shehunid Raiders offer their services to the Imperium alongside the Schenk Auxiliaries. The Tanith 1st, known as First and Only, or Gaunt's Ghosts, faced great loss when their homeworld of Tanith was destroyed in the year 765 of the 41st millennium. The 23rd Armoured Tolinbraders, 33rd Urdesh, and various Urdesh units, including the 4th Light, 6th, 7th Stormtroopers, and 10th, form an essential part of the Imperial strategy. The 2nd Vitrian Mobile, 10th Vitrian Armoured Brigade, and 161st Vitrian Heavy Support complete this formidable assembly. Finally, the Volpone 50th, known as Blue Bloods, and the 34th Rawback and 52nd Rawback Heavy Infantry, the latter nicknamed Fighting Felids, stand ready to defend the Imperium against any threat. Imperial Navy. Senior command of the Imperial Navy is led by Admiral Christor and Admiral Shaver, with Vice Admirals Garnhorst, Sanlock, and von Heigel supporting their efforts. The command suffered losses with Vice Admiral Alba van der Treek and Commodore Villa Waldesh, both killed in action at Adolorata in 773 of the 41st millennium. Flight Marshal Carol Haydn oversees aerial operations, while First Officer Bernard Falcor was also lost at Adolorata in the same year. Air support. The air support units of the Imperial Navy consist of several specialized wings, each playing a crucial role in aerial operations. Notable formations include the 33rd Callian Air Wing, 39th Fighter Wing, 42nd Fighter Wing Prefects, 44th Fighter Wing, 63rd Fighter Wing Sundogs, 75th Goran Goshawk Wing, 5th Kulan Flight Wing, 101st Navy Elite Wing Apostles, Fantine 20 Umbra Wing, 138th Fighter Wing, 235th Imperial Naval Attack Wing, 409th Fighter Wing Raptors, 666th Fighter Wing Devil Dogs, 786th Fighter Wing, 2212th Imperial Naval Attack Wing, 2265th Fighter Wing. Fleet elements. The known fleet elements include several significant vessels, each with its own history. The Borealis serves as the flagship for War Master Slado. The Claudia, a cruiser, remains missing in action since 758 of the 41st millennium. The Godefroy Magnificat, an Apocalypse-class battleship, was destroyed in 760 of the 41st millennium, while the Hastur and Intangible, both heavy cruisers, were lost in 773 of the 41st millennium. The Light of the Throne continues to operate, but the Lord Falchion, another cruiser, was destroyed in 757 of the 41st millennium. The No Quarter, a destroyer, was also destroyed in 773 of the 41st millennium, while the Saint Oriental and Shako heavy cruisers remain active. The Sire Oswald Whitmere, a destroyer, and the Tarquin, another heavy cruiser, were both lost in 773 of the 41st millennium. Finally, the Ziegler, a frigate, has been missing since 758 of the 41st millennium. Adeptus Ministorum, Ecclesiarch Tarquel Benedictor Ausonius, oversaw War Master Makaroth's election ceremony within the High Basilica at the city of Balopolis on Balhaut in 765 of the 41st millennium. Forces of Chaos. Senior Command. Forces of Chaos are commanded by several key figures, including Archon Nadzibar, who was killed in action at Balhaut in 765 of the 41st millennium, and Archon Urlok Gar. Arek Etugar met his end at Lyubov in 778 of the 41st millennium. Magister Alikan was killed in 765 of the 41st millennium, while Magister Heritor Asphodel fell at Vergast in 769 of the 41st millennium. Magister Nokad the Blighted was killed at Bucephalon, and Magister Kul is presumed killed in action at Balhaut in 765 of the 41st millennium. Among them is also Magister Cooks of the Eyeless. Magister Enoch Innocenti was killed at Herodor in 773 of the 41st millennium, and Magister Kul Kolesh was killed at Balhaut in 765 of the 41st millennium. Magister Cuvelo fell at Sverren in 757 of the 41st millennium, while Magister Shebol Redhand was killed at Karn III in 773 of the 41st millennium. Additional members include Magister Anakwana Sek and Magister Sharanidi. Magister Sholanskara was captured by the Inquisition on Sapientia in 768 of the 41st millennium, and Magister Rushek Vakim was killed at Nizon II in 768 of the 41st millennium. Chaos forces consist of Blood Pact, Charismites, Echelons, 1st and 5th Echelons, Excubitors, Gutkra, Thorns of Heaven, Infadi, the Kith, Red Phalanx, Sons of Sek, and the Tongues of Charesh. Known Chaos fleet elements include several notable vessels: Bloodmark, Destitution, Cicatrice, Revenant, Harm's Way, and Suture, all classified as cruisers. The fleet also features the Incarnadine, which is a battleship, along with the Crown of Thorns and Prudence Vial, both also battleships. The Recurve Blade is identified as a frigate, while Unnatural Causes is classified as a heavy cruiser. The Sabbat World's Crusade stands as a vivid testament to the Imperium's resilience in the fight against chaos. How much longer can humanity resist these dark forces?